As with all wars, it seems there's a talk of battles and bombings and triumphs and defeats and arguments back and forth, but how much do we know what happens to the ordinary people themselves who are there, right in the middle of it all? What happens to them? And so we have a Middle Eastern conflagration again. Lebanese terrorists, that is the PLO in Lebanon. We have the Israeli bombings. We have the attempted assassination of Israel's ambassador, Shlomo Argov. And as the New York Times reported, the bombings have been in retaliation for the shooting and other, as they term it, terrorist activities. Now, what happens to the people living in those communities? And we thought perhaps hear from Reverend Donald Wagner, who's a Presbyterian minister, for a time associate minister of the First Presbyterian Church of Evanston, now with the Christian ministry at Northwestern, a member of the American Palestinian Rights Committee, and also the Middle Eastern Council of Churches, Middle East, which is part of the umbrella group World Council of Churches. He and a group of his colleagues were there in Beirut recently, just came back, and for him simply to describe what he saw and what he experienced. In a moment, Reverend Donald Wagner after this message. Reverend Wagner, you just came back from Beirut, and I was thinking, as I read the Times the other day, New York Times, they speak of the bombings, from Lebanon onto Israeli settlements, and the mayor Ephraim Sharer is quoted, the mayor of Nahariya. You know that city, yeah. And he says it was long overdue. I hope it will be a successful action, because 8 years ago we've been under the threat of terrorists all the time, and there's reference here to the children, to Israeli children, and the fear to which they're subjected and how they're holding up under it. Now, you've seen something happening at the other end. Suppose you describe who you are, the group, and what you experienced in Beirut.
Thank you, yeah. I'm a Presbyterian clergy person, have been concerned with the Lebanese, Israeli, Palestinian arc of crisis for some time, 3-4 years, and just recently left the church to do this, pretty much full-time, still maintaining some contacts at Northwestern. One of our real concerns is to continue to raise the issue of the Palestinian crisis and their human rights with progressive groups in the peace community and the church community, and with the Jewish community for those that are, really troubled by this also. Most recently, we took a group of 8 clergy and Christian relief organization developers to Lebanon. We tried to visit refugee camps. We tried to talk to political leadership in the right wing in Lebanon, in the PLO, in the Lebanese government. We visited monasteries. We visited all types of church communities just to get an understanding and to see how Americans might help in relief. We also organized a group of 8 nurses and doctors and took them there, hoping they would get involved in terms of lending their skills, but doing a feasibility study of founding a clinic. We got caught in the middle of the war. In fact, I was with our group of clergy in the hotel Friday at 3:10 p.m. when the first bomb struck.
The hotel where?
In Beirut, the Beau Rivage Hotel, which happened to be 7 or 8 blocks from the first Israeli strike. If we had been on our schedule, we were on Arab time, it's a little bit slower, thankfully. If we had been on our schedule, we would have been driving by that sports city which was hit. And, I'm sure we may have made it by, but we could have been hit with the bombs. And the feeling of terror that we felt in our hotel, the possibility of what if, but then wondering about the innocent and so on.
What did you, this was when?
This was Friday.
Friday, June
5th, was it? We went to the basement. There were children. There was a conference going on.
To the basement
of the hotel. We thought the bombs were going to hit us next. I had never been in combat before, and we were just shaking. It was very close. There was a lull. We went up to the balcony to look out to see where they hit, and it was the big sports center and the refugee camp around it. It was in flames. We saw medical personnel and some journalists and others rush in, and then the bombs hit again. And we have all of it on film. But the tragedy is, as we went and visited the hospitals the next day, we saw the victims.
In Beirut?
In Beirut. We went to the hospitals that those who were in the sports center and in the camps around went to. We saw a 2-month-old baby who lost his or her parents. I think he was a boy. His rump and back was blown off. His arm was broken. We were visiting some of the wounded. These were civilians that we saw. And then when we were making our rounds in the hospital the next Saturday morning, the bombing hit again. We were just getting out of our cars Saturday morning. It was about 11:50 when a bomb hit within 3/4 of a mile of where we were. We were rushed to the basement of the hospital, Akka Hospital in Beirut. And an ambulance arrived about 10 minutes later, and we found then that a United Nations bus with 35 teenage schoolgirls had been hit on the coastal road as it was going to Sablin Vocational Center. 19 girls were dead, and we saw all the corpses come in. We saw the wounded, the mangled come in, and we sat for 5 hours as this continued all day. Mothers were brought in. I remember, I'll never forget, Mrs. Saidi and the older daughter found out, and they went berserk when they found out their youngest daughter had been killed.
You and the group, how many were there in the group?
Well, by then, our group of 8 clergy and relief people were there. On Thursday night, our group of 8 medical people arrived. They were on a separate tour that morning. They joined us in the bomb shelter at the bottom of the hospital, and they were pressed into service immediately. They were working side by side with the doctors, helping those who were still alive, and they told me later, gee, if we had them in Northwestern Hospital, we could have saved 8 of the 19. But it was tragic.
The reason the Israelis offer, aside from the attempted assassination of Argov, is the continuous rockets falling in from the PLO Lebanese base, falling into and injuring that too innocents and civilians.
And I deplore that, and we speak with people in the PLO. There's no reason for the violence. You're going to bring on a massacre that you can't afford, and we're against the loss of any human life. But I think one thing that has to be said is that the ambassador, who was tragically, and we deplore that, in that assassination attempt in London, that was denounced by the PLO, and it's later been found out that was another Iraqi or some other Arab group that may have done this to bring on other things, which is deplorable. But the fact that this bombing would take place in response to that, and then continue all night on the Sabbath, was just tragic to us.
When you say the bombings that took place, there were certain kinds of planes.
They were U.S.-made F-16s. There were phosphorus firebombs. There were cluster bombs. We have stop-action photos of the phosphorus bombs coming down and hitting.
What's a phosphorus? What does that do?
It's a I don't know the chemical reaction, but it's a anti-personnel heat bomb. And these were what were used on the camps in the sports city on that Friday.
Or the camps, the sports city, you say?
In Beirut. The sports city was a combination of things. It's a huge arena, like Soldier Field. They had refugees in one end, they had military vehicles, and then we understand the munitions dump in another. They had a massive food cooperative in another section. So it could be justified as a military target. I'm sure that was there. But there were also refugees there, and it went up. And as in war, there's not that much discrimination. And I think we have to, counter the myth that these bombing raids were selected targets, military targets. In some cases, yeah. But in other cases, a school bus of teenagers is not. Along the coastal road on a Saturday morning when people are driving back and forth, that's not a military target. And in war, this happens, right? But that we have to begin differentiating what is a selected target and eliminate that myth and say we are against this cycle of violence.
You were there for, you were there for how long?
We were there for 8 days, and we were in our hotel or moving around during the time of the invasion's beginning, starting with this Friday 310 bombing.
Well, how do you know they were? You spoke of the planes. How do you know they were those sort of planes?
Well, we could get pretty. We saw them quite closely,
Oh,
and in the telephoto lens, you could stop it and see the model, the swept back jet, and then knowing what they are from previous reading.
how do you know they were phosphorus bombs, for instance?
Well, this is what was reported by even U.S. ABC and NBC correspondents, and then we saw footage of the heat flaming bombs coming down just before they struck.
So, now the medical team that followed you, what was their work? I mean, how could they help?
Well, we had nurses with very good medical skills, some of whom had served in emergency wards, so they could be pressed into action to treat those who had extreme burns and who were hit with shrapnel or flying glass. So there were 7 or 8 there were about 6 who were used in that capacity with immediate emergency. A couple of others, just were used as aides.
So when you and the group left, what was happening as you were leaving? What was
Our group of 8 clergy and religious people had finished our itinerary, so we were going to depart on Wednesday. So we backed it up and said, well, it sounds bad, so we moved out on Monday. The others are still there, which is of great concern. So we went out to the airport, and there was a lull in the bombing around Beirut, so we went to the airport and were able to convince them to put us on a flight. And it took some convincing, but we felt pretty convinced we should.
I don't know what else there's to say. Just this is your detailing what you saw and your colleagues saw, and the response to that, of course, is that the PLO is using bases there for shelling Israeli settlements, and Israeli civilians, including men, women, children, are also killed.
That's right,
and so we have a war again, don't we?
Boy,
in
it's
1982.
It's a tragic war. It's I see it as a massacre of the Palestinian people in their stronghold of Lebanon. Yes, it's breaking the back of the PLO, but it's also massacring a lot of innocent civilians, Lebanese and Palestinians. And I'm worried that the Sharon plan, which is to break the back of the Palestinians in Lebanon and drive them into Jordan, and then the plan that's been implemented since November to crush the Palestinians on the West Bank in many different ways, that they go hand in hand.
The response to that is it isn't a question of crushing Palestinians. It's a question of guaranteeing their own safety.
Yeah.
And so we come to the question of recognition of a Palestinian state and the security of Israel, don't we? So the obvious same thing to do would be for them to meet, wouldn't it?
It would.
And to have a simultaneous guarantee of both entities.
Absolutely. And I only wish that the United States was more interested in that, in the government. The FOD peace plan, the 8-point Saudi plan, if the United States had shown more interest to enable that, I believe that Arafat and many of the leaders in the PLO were ready to accept it. There are progressive forces within Israel that were pressing for that. And unfortunately, that did not happen.
See, apparently, what we haven't heard from are whatever forces there might be within the PLO that is moderate, and the debate that undoubtedly is going on within Israel itself. So it's those particular groups we haven't heard from.
That's the tragedy, that these, I think, are the voices of reason and of justice, and if they had been heard, something could have averted this. But now I wonder if it's too late.
Of course, it's not too late to stop the bombings, not too late to stop shellings from either side. But so this leaves us with something that you saw, that you yourself and your colleagues saw, and that is the death of children. and of other civilians.
Yeah. And I only hope and pray that somehow, Americans in the church and the Jewish community and the peace groups can feel that. That whenever a Jewish child is killed by a rocket in Kiryat Shimona, but also whenever a Palestinian child or a Lebanese child is killed in Rashidia, in Tyre and Sidon, that we should have a feeling of outrage about that. And that perhaps our government in the U.S., where we happen to sit right now, which is sending the F-16s and these bombs over there, gliding right through Congress and Senate without much opposition, needs to take another look at that, because we're fueling an unbelievable massacre right now that's going to get worse. So this is
also the UN too.
Well, yeah, which is another story. Hopefully something can be negotiated. I don't have much confidence, but I hope that through the Lebanese ambassador and others, that something could be negotiated for an Israeli withdrawal. What I fear is that now there will be a new move in Lebanon to create kind of a right-wing phalangist government. Elections are due in September. That Major Haddad in the south, who is being handed over the Beaufort Castle and other things by Begin, will be implanted even deeper there, and that a lot of the progressive forces in Lebanon have been crushed, and the Palestinians will be totally crushed in Lebanon. I wish there would be an end to all acts of terrorism on both sides, but I fear the dismemberment of Lebanon, and it will never be the same again.
Reverend Don Wagner is my guest, and he's simply commenting his own thoughts, but mostly his own observations there, you see. The fact that you saw something with your own eyes, this we know. We see variations of it on occasion on newsreels. But it comes right down to human beings on both sides of the border, and they're the ones who really foot the bill.
Yeah.
Foot the bill, oh boy. And by the way, there's a group, the medical group, isn't there, if people are interested?
Yeah, there's the group, the United Holy Land Fund, here in Chicago, is a national organization, and they're collecting now for medical relief, and donations can be sent to 51 West Jackson in Chicago, 60604, United Holy Land Fund.
I think a way to end this conversation probably two pieces of music. One an Israeli song and one a Palestinian song.
Very good.
Reverend Donald Wagner is my guest. He called the other day, and he says he just came from Beirut with his colleagues and he'd like to report what he saw. And since we don't hear too much of this, I thought perhaps we should know that a human life is sacred, no matter the obvious cliche. But it has to be repeated, unfortunately. Thank you very much indeed. And
Thank you.
Here's some music. It's a couple of weeks later now, and I'm seated here with Joe Elder. Joe's been a guest in this program before. He's visited areas that might have been described as no man's land during the Vietnam War. He had been to Hanoi and spoke of what he saw. And Joe Elder, who teaches sociology and South Asian Studies at Madison, University of Wisconsin, has also worked with the American Friends Service Committee group on the subject of, in fact, the book is called, published by Helen Wang, A Compassionate Peace, dealing with the place where Don Wagner, the Middle East. And so the story that Don tells, Reverend Wagner, is one with which you, no doubt, are familiar.
Right. We've been keeping in as close touch as we can with what is going on in that section of the world right now. As a matter of fact, there are a couple of American Friends Service Committee representatives in the area on both sides of the border to keep us as thoroughly briefed as they can on what's happening. Ann Nixon is one of our people who's in Beirut. And Ron and Carol Young are actually going into the Galilee section of Israel, which was a section that was being shelled. The concern here, as we Quakers have traditionally had it, one of victims on all sides of the war. It does seem as though the most massive civilian injuries are in the northern sides, that is in Lebanon, but there have been casualties also in Israel.
So the question comes up, what's to be done? This question has come up ever since. And so, because this gets more and more horrendous as we go along, and surely there are reasonable men and women on both sides here. So what's to be done? What is a compassionate peace? What did the committee, of which you remember, come up with?
We were asked about 2.5 years ago by the American Friends Service Committee, 5 of us, to put our heads together to talk with Israelis, to talk with Lebanese, to talk with Egyptians, members of the PLO, Saudi Arabians, about exactly the question you raised. What could reasonable people do to bring some kind of a peace in the area which would last? As the 2 years developed during which we worked on the book, a basic formula did seem to come out. It's nothing terribly new. It's something that seems to emerge as more and more people look at the area. But the basic components of it seem to rest on 2 axes. First of all, Israel's right to exist within secure boundaries in that section of the world indefinitely. And that seems to be a basic prerequisite, which even those who are not happy with Israel's existence, I think, have come to accept as simply a matter of fact. The other, and this is where things get tough, the other is the right of Palestinians to have a homeland. Now, in the Camp David agreements, there were discussions about Palestinian autonomy and so on. But the Palestinian refugees who are scattered around the Near East right now, concentrated on the West Bank, but also in the southern areas of Lebanon and now many other parts of the Middle East, will continue to be a displaced group of people and a belligerent group of people until there is some section of territory which they can say is their homeland. So the suggestions we worked out, and these, I say, weren't particularly unique or clever, but they were something which we heard voices on all sides saying, the quiet voices and the thoughtful voices, that this would be the basis, a recognition of the rights of both the Palestinians and the Israelis to a homeland of a kind with certain kinds of guarantees. Now the question comes, how does one move in that direction? The policies of terrorism which the PLO had been pursuing, we felt were counterproductive, and our book condemns terrorism in all forms. One can perhaps explain why there is terrorism, frustration which simply appears to have no chance of being recognized, but that certainly doesn't justify it or legitimize it. The Israeli concern about their own national security is something which, again, can be understood. They have ample reason to be suspicious of people around them. But unless there's some kind of a break in the impasse, precisely the events of the last 2 weeks could have been predicted. That at a certain point, a simmering war breaks into a very hot war, in this case a brutal war, so that at the moment, in a period of about 2 weeks, 600,000, more than 500,000 refugees have been created, something between 10 and 12,000 dead, something around 26,000 wounded, and in the refugee camps in southern Lebanon, something like 90% destruction of those camps. Now that has brought a kind of military stopping point, but it's only pushed the problem, in a sense, one step more difficult in terms of working anything out.
Well, see, the matter of a independent Palestinian state and the security of Israel, these subjects have always come up for time. The question about how, I suppose Israel asks the guarantee. And why can't PLO, the others, guarantee that? And why can't simultaneously Israel recognize the right of Palestinian people to have their own land?
There certainly are people in Israel who feel that that Israel's long-range security lies in that area. I think part of the problem is that there are 2 different views of security. One is the dream of Israel surrounded by friendly nations, in a sense enjoying mutual prosperity. And the other is a kind of view of Israel as a strong fighting nation which will beat anybody who tries to give it trouble. And somehow the transition has to be made from one to the other, and it's a very difficult transition to make. There are voices in Israel right now which do say Israel's long-range security lies in there being an independent Palestinian state at peace with us. There are others who say you can't trust the PLO any further than you can throw them. We have to beat them down every time they raise their heads, and that's the only way in which security lies. Our Quaker response was that the real security of Israel lies in the long run in establishing peaceful relations with its neighbors. And if it means giving back territory which was taken at one point, fine. That's a cheap price to pay for stability and survival.
You know, I was thinking, this sounds naive, but why can't the country, says, who's going to make the first move? This goes on again. Who's going to make the first move? It occurs to me, Israel won the Six-Day War, a highly technologized nation. Suppose they said, right off the bat, unilaterally, we recognize the Palestinians as having the right to a land of their own. If they said that, and there was no return response guaranteeing Israel's right to exist, well, then Israel would have world opinion on its side.
Precisely.
So why, or otherwise, or the alternative, peace. Now, why can't they? What, is it a matter of machismo here, a matter of face? I'm putting the ball, if I use the cliche, in Israel's court.
Right. I think the ball could be put in either side's court, although today I think the ball is in Israel's court.
Well, the fact is, I put it in the court of what is obviously the stronger,
Right.
The more highly technologized society. You know, let's say, there's no comparison, but let's say the analogy of Britain and its technology with U.S. help as against Argentina. I'm not comparing the two. Argentina is a fascist junta. I'm really saying from the standpoint of military might, you know, and high technology. And since it is the land of people through the years have suffered and understood,
Right.
who would better understand refugees than they?
That suggestion was made to me
Yeah.
by an Israeli veteran yesterday.
I was.
And it was intriguing to me that it came from him. He said, if Prime Minister Begin were now to take the moment in history, which comes perhaps once every 20 years, and were to say, today we recognize an independent Palestinian state, it's there, it's yours, take the PLO, we're prepared to grant you independence, that would be the kind of statement which would equal, I think, in world excitement, Sadat's visit to Jerusalem. I mean, an important political figure taking a kind of risk, but a risk which would bring such widespread world support that it would be virtually impossible for the Palestinians, the PLO, other Palestinian groups, to say, this is indeed what we've been after, and we can't fault you on it. So there is a chance, and if Prime Minister Begin felt that he could, I think that out of the horror of the last 2 weeks might come something which would bring a sigh of relief to the whole world. But I wouldn't. The PLO could also have done something like that. I think this week it's Israel's turn. But if the PLO were to step forward and say, we recognize the right of Israel to live at peace, to be here, suddenly that would take the steam out of the hawk's view in Israel that the PLO is committed to its destruction.
You know, being realistic, we know that PLO has so many splits in it.
Right.
You know, that the odds are they will not make the first move. Perhaps they should, but they won't. It should be simultaneous. So I'm saying specifically Israel. Now, I don't see how it can lose. Now, how can it lose? If it makes the first move and says, we recognize the Palestinians, we do, okay. Now do you recognize the right to exist? Still be prepared. Now, if they say no, then world opinion has switched.
That's right.
Obviously, Israel has not won world opinion on its side during these Lebanese air raids.
Certainly not during the last 2 weeks. No, you're right. In fact, for the first time, I'm told, in Israel itself, there have been ads taken out by Israeli civilians critical of the waging of the war, and this has not happened in earlier wars. No, I agree with you, Studs. It seems to me that this is one of those moments where Israel would have very little to lose and a great deal to win if it were to take that position.
And the other question is something going on? Is this debate going on now? You said Begin. Well, the odds are pretty good he won't do it. He won't. But are there other voices heard now, as far as your sources tell you? in Israel?
There are certainly voices in Israel. Now, how much weight they would carry is another issue. There's the Peace Now movement in Israel, which is a broad spectrum movement which has been saying for years now that Israel's security lies in friendship with its neighbors. And there are any number of thoughtful, well-organized people in that movement who would favor that. But, can Prime Minister Begin do it? It would be turning his whole position almost backwards. And yet he also is a very wise politician. And I think he recognizes the price that one pays for what one has done in the last 2 weeks, and he may recognize that this is perhaps a way of recouping a lot of loss.
Perhaps wishful thinking on my part. I assume there are other voices in Israel. I know there are.
Mm-hmm.
But I wonder to what extent the debate is going on there. Of course, very often debate is muted when something, a war of sorts happens.
Right. Well, I think the fact that in the Israeli press one is having Israeli citizens protesting their own government's actions for the first time in Israel's history indicates that there's a tip of an iceberg here, and we don't know how much more of the iceberg there is.
By the way, the compassionate peace, a compassionate peace, future of the Middle East, that's put up with the American Friends Service Committee, of which Joe Elder is a working member. There are more specific things too, dealing with United Nations.
Right. The United Nations has been called in repeatedly to play a buffer role in keeping the armies away from each other. And one of the things that we endorse thoroughly, since there have been a number of Security Council resolutions dealing with the Middle East, that those perhaps provide as good a starting point for any resolution of the Middle East situation as one could have. These include the notions of ultimately going back to the boundaries as they were before various wars began to emerge, and also keeping a strong UN presence as a buffer between the northern sections of Israel and the southern section of Lebanon, a buffer which was broken through during the last couple of weeks. We also take a somewhat strong position on the Israeli settlements in the West Bank. Our feeling is that this is not in accord with the understanding at Camp David, and that as each settlement goes up in the West Bank, it's just that much more difficult for the West Bank to be turned over to a Palestinian entity. One of our suggestions, which we hadn't heard other people's make, was that U.S. financial assistance to Israel should be publicly reduced by whatever expenditures are being spent on those settlements, inasmuch as we see those settlements, each one as one more obstacle toward the kind of resolution you and I were talking about.
And now we come to also, you said U.S., we come to the two superpowers, U.S., USSR, and the roles they play in supplying arms. Don Wagner, at the beginning, was talking about U.S. planes used by the Israelis in dropping the phosphorus bombs, the F-16s. And so we also read of MiG planes, Soviet planes, used by the other side. So there we go again, don't we?
It's been almost scary to see how much of the world's purchase of hardware has been made in the Middle East in the last 10 years. The escalation, when one looks at it, is alarming. I think it's something like 1/3 of the weapons sales currently in the world are going to the Middle Eastern countries. Now, here are countries that have enormous tensions between themselves and among themselves, and for the Soviet Union and for ourselves to be pouring in arms at request is, in a sense, simply enhancing the danger. Would the events of the last couple of weeks have happened without massive U.S. military supplies? I'm not sure. But I'm fairly sure the presence of those supplies was a strong factor in the decision to make the raids on Beirut and Sidon and Tyre and so on. And we, in a sense, whether we intended to or not, have become partners in this terrific destruction.
Yeah, I'm thinking of, I'm going to get in trouble again. I'm thinking of our press again. The headline is, we read of the MiGs used by the anti-Israeli forces.
Right.
We're not worried about the F-16s that the Israelis have used that dropped stuff on the civilians in Beirut.
Right. In fact, one report that I was reading indicated that our own military planners have been quite intrigued by what's going on here, simply in the sense of a laboratory experiment of Soviet equipment versus U.S. equipment. and that they are intrigued with the way in which the machines worked against each other. This is one of the more morbid kinds of spectatorship that one can imagine. The Israelis did manage to render ineffective the surface-to-air missiles that they'd purchased from the Soviet Union, and the American military is very, very interested in how they did that.
Yeah, stick with this. You see, some of the military guys, and this probably could apply to the Soviets as well, on the other side, watching it and judging it, and some of the American military guys were saying, hey, let's watch this thing. See, you know what it reminds me of? Spanish Civil War.
Precisely.
When since I'm referring to both sides, I'm not going to get in trouble here, both U.S. and USSR. But in the Spanish Civil War, the Nazis were testing.
Right.
The Condor Legion was testing the air warfare when they helped Franco against the Spanish Republicans.
And to a certain extent, the same thing seems to have happened. The Israeli military, for example, were very successful in knocking out the surface-to-air missiles. How did they do it? The American military wants to know, and they're going to be over there, I'm sure, in a big hurry to find out. Similarly, the American planes were much more effective in the air than the Soviet planes. And if one takes any kind of a hard count, the Soviet machine losses were much, much higher than the Americans. So again, one has an uneasy feeling that the U.S. military is not entirely unhappy this war occurred, because they've been able to see how their equipment has been used. They've been able, at no cost in American lives, to figure out ways in which they can implement strategies into U.S. Military activities.
So it's impossible to talk about peace in the Middle East unless the role of the two superpowers is recognized here, role that is deleterious.
Right. In this case, it's been interesting. On one hand, they've both been pouring in arms to their respective friends in the Middle East for the last 10 years. On the other hand, once the fighting broke out, they stood shoulder to shoulder in trying to halt Israel. I mean, it's a mixed agenda that's being given. And I think mixed signals are being given. One wonders, for example, what might have been done if there had been clearer statements of what the U.S. position would be in terms of denunciation prior to the Israeli invasion. I'm not sure it would have stopped it, but I think there were enough ambiguous signals being given by our current administration so that Bacon could feel, well, we can go in and do a major job before the U.S. decides to become critical.
Well, what's the outlook? I mean, what further work is being done by the American friends in their investigative reports, reportage?
Okay, at the moment, any investigation is being upstaged by the need for funds for refugees. It's appalling what has happened to human beings. And at the moment, the American Friends Service Committee is launching a massive fundraising drive to get money over there for the wounded, the hungry, the sick, and so on. Beyond that...
These are refugees, many of them created by the recent raid.
Absolutely. And the majority of them are from the recent raid. Over 500,000 people, if one reads the State Department estimates. And when you look at major cities like Tyre and Sidon that are virtually uninhabitable, and then just look at the pictures of what's happened to Beirut, these are major cities that have been rendered in many areas unlivable, with the breakdown of water supplies, food, the outbreak of disease, and so on. So we have a staggering human problem, and that's where the Quaker energies are going to go, as will the energies of many other humanitarian organizations. But above and beyond that, the ultimate solution isn't simply going to be taking care of refugees. The ultimate solution is going to have to be a political one that we think recognizes the hard realities that if these countries are going to live, they have to live as neighbors with each other. And how can there be a breakthrough in the impasse so that those of goodwill and concern can have their voices heard?
Joseph Elder is my guest. At this moment, then, the great need is funds for food, clothing, shelter for the newly created refugees.
That's right. The 600.
And where is that? Is the Quakers are working on it?
The Quakers are working on it. If the American Friends Service Committee is putting out ads. If one is interested, the checks can be sent with an indication that this is for the refugees to the American Friends Service Committee at 1501 Cherry Street, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania 19102. But we're just one of many organizations that are trying hard to meet the human need before the unnecessary suffering goes on any longer.
Do you work with Oxfam?
Oxfam's one that we do work with. Also, at the moment, the Middle East Council of Churches is very active, as are various Red Cross agencies. There are 5 or 6 that are already there. But getting there and then getting the supplies and the food and the water are 2 different things. And at the moment, the need is desperate for money.
Well, Joe, any base we haven't touched?
I guess to the extent that a base needs to be touched, it has an echo for the U.S. as well. I think looking at how nations relate to each other, and especially taking a 20 or 30-year look at the Middle East, it seems as though the only resolution to what's been going on is going to have to be a political accommodation with the Palestinians with a homeland. One reason I say this is that even if one assumes peace, watching the way in which the demography is working, watching the way in which the number of Arabs living in Israel will expand proportionally because of the birth rate and so on, Israel is going to find itself in 20 or 25 years with a minority of Jews governing a majority of non-Jews. And this isn't good for any nation, especially when the non-Jews will continue to resent the kind of treatment they have. So it's not idealism in the Pollyanna sense. I think it's idealism in a very hard-headed sense, that looking ahead, things are only going to get worse. And now may be one of those times where a courageous Begin or courageous voices from within Israel can demand that the military approach to a solution be ended, and that a solution that recognizes the rights of the Palestinians to a homeland, that those voices be heard and recognized.
Joseph Elder, my guest, teacher, professor of sociology and South Asian studies at the University of Wisconsin up in Madison, and a member of the American Friends Service Committee, particularly the task force that came through with the book A Compassionate Peace, that is available, Helen Wang, the publishers. We'll hear some music. We'll hear music both Israeli and Arabic, Middle East, both. And in a sense, when hearing music, of course, you hear visions and dreams of both. And of course, which lends a note to the madness that is a Middle Eastern conflict.
Right. And in many ways, the folks on all sides of the border now share common histories of suffering, common histories of heroism, common histories of tragedy, and one hopes that the future will hold a common history of promise.
And one other thing, I suppose, just to add about how the madness is not simply confined to Middle East, though there it's most dramatic. We think both are Semites, of course, both
Right.
sides, and we're up in Northern Ireland now, too. And both are white, the same names. There it's religion.
Right.
You know, or religious down there, too, to some extent. So you never thought, who'd have thought that in the latter part of the 20th century, the time of Einstein, post-Einstein, nuclear threats, who'd have thought the religious wars we read about back in the days of the Crusades and the 30 Years' War and God knows what, the religious wars of centuries ago are still fought.
Right. And passions still run high, and memories run deep, and people are willing to kill each other for dreams which neither of them can fulfill through the killing.
And so we say, hail, American Friends, a service committee, and a vision of what human beings can be and how they can live. Thank you very much, Joe.
Thanks for letting me on your program, Studs.